Elon, it has been a while. It's good to see you.
Yeah, you too. And I just realized by a while, you mean actually, I guess it has been a while since we're both like wandering around various parts of the United States this week.
Yeah, so welcome. Folks are piling into the Zoom room, and I know we're sending this out on Substack as well. So we're going to take a couple of minutes to just let everybody connect and get online. But welcome to a special edition of Word on the Street Live. We usually are live on Wednesdays at 4 p.m. Eastern. And this week, with the breaking news of the agreement last night in Sharm el-Sheikh and hopefully progress towards an actual ceasefire and hostage release and surge of aid deal. We thought it was important to get together. This morning, I woke up and I read an account of what happened from an old friend, Gershon Baskin, who's been very involved in negotiations over the years with Hamas and clearly was a player in the background of some of the talks here. And I saw his post and I said it would be great to have Gershon on with us. So we sent him a note and hopefully he'll be joining us over the course of this conversation, probably about quarter past the hour, I would expect. And he's over in Jerusalem, so it's uh, it's really nice of him to stay up late. So I'm looking forward to the discussion. We're going to dig in a little bit. Um, I wanted to start though by acknowledging where I am, Elon. I'm sitting at the Carter Center. It just so happens that I'm in Atlanta and was a long scheduled trip. And I was doing a little presentation for the Carter Presidential Center staff today on the conflict and J Street's position and role and all that. And it just so happens that, today's the day this happens. And I'm sitting in front of a picture, which I think is blurry in the Zoom video. But it's a picture of Jimmy Carter on the porch at Camp David with Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat. And it's nearly 50 years ago, the three of them negotiating the Egypt-Israel peace agreement. And it is, one of the great achievements of Middle East peace diplomacy in our lives and certainly in the history of all these different conflicts. And it's just very meaningful to me to be sitting here with Jimmy Carter sort of in the background. He's somebody that I am very personally connected to and started my political career working as a high school kid in one of his presidential campaigns. And when we started J Street, he called me directly and said how excited he was to see a voice from within the Jewish community that was going to be speaking out for peace and human rights. And so to be here having this conversation with you, with him looking over my shoulder, is very meaningful, Elon.
Oh, that's awesome. That's it's beautiful. And I got to tell you, Jeremy, I've been saying again and again, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about it more, but it was the trauma of the Yom Kippur War and the realization in the aftermath, both in Israeli society and also for the United States, right? Kissinger in particular, and then handing off to Carter, that really took what was a horrible moment and turned it into the Camp David Accords a few years later. And maybe on my optimistic days, I make the case that the horrors of October 7th eventually take us to a much better place as everybody recalculates, as everybody realizes we can't go back to where we were and starts to build a better future. And just maybe today was a very important day, and yesterday being a very important day in starting to paint that pathway.
So I don't want us to overstate and overplay everything. This isn't the comprehensive once in every 3,000 years peace deal that the president has outlined. But give us your take. I know you've written about this today, and people can read what you've written. We're going to be sending out an email from J Street, and it's up on our Substack. But give us a little bit of your analysis of exactly what is in this deal, what it means, and then we'll talk a little bit about what it doesn't mean. We'll talk about how we got here, and we'll get Gershon in on the conversation soon, I'm sure. So take it away.
Yeah, yeah. Look, I think I'm really very pleasantly surprised how quickly this happened, shocked at how quickly it happened. We had this 20-point plan that was put out just 10 days ago. And when you and I were talking, biggest concern was the details of this could just drag on forever. And what we kept saying needed to happen was instead of focusing on the 20, let's focus on the first three or four. And that's what they did to their credit. And it's get the hostages out, get aid in, end the war, trade Palestinian prisoners. The biggest, hardest sticking point was agreeing on lines of withdrawal for the IDF. Another big concern we had, And so that seems to have been worked out. We don't know exactly what's in it yet, but that seems to have been worked out. And then the other big concern we had was this issue of insisting on Hamas demilitarization and disarmament before you could do anything. And I think they wisely kind of punted on that issue for the moment. So we have a deal that ends the war, assuming it holds. It's going to be dicey. We saw just news in the last hour of Israel bombing in Gaza because the effect hasn't gone in yet, and Palestinians being killed. We're going to
When does it
continue.
go into effect? What's the actual time that this will happen?
I think it needs to be ratified. It's in the process of being ratified. And then after it's ratified by the Israeli cabinet, it goes, my understanding is it goes into effect a few hours later. But we have a guest who's arrived, Jeremy. So
That is correct. We are really excited and very grateful to an old friend, Gershon Baskin, who I'm sure everybody is very familiar with. Uh, Gershon is in Jerusalem, so for him it is now a little past 11 p.m. And I'm just very grateful personally to Gershon for doing this so late in the day. I'm sure that your pulse rate and your adrenaline have been going all day and are keeping you awake given all that is happening. But for those who don't know, Gershon is a veteran of negotiations towards peace, and particularly in the context of negotiating with Hamas. We've had many occasions to talk to Gershon about his role in the Gilad Shalit deal back now quite a few years ago. He has worked in a whole range of Israeli-Palestinian dialogue programs. I first met him probably 30 years ago in some of the people-to-people work that he's been doing. But really importantly, in the last few months, he's been behind the scenes involved in some of the quiet talks that have helped to lay the groundwork for what has just happened. And so, Gershon, welcome. You've got some really, good insights and some good perspective from all of us. And we were just discussing a little bit Elon's take on what we, see has been achieved, what still remains to be done. But one of the questions I'm curious to get your take. Elon used the phrase, "This is the end of the war," and is it the end of the war? What is the guarantee that once all the exchanges are done and the first three or four steps are in place, that the fighting doesn't start again? So take it away, Gershon, go wherever you want. But that's certainly a question at the top of my mind. I'm interested in your
Sure.
take.
Look, Jeremy, thank you very much for inviting me. And Elon, it's good to see you again.
yeah, you too,
It's always a
Gershon.
pleasure to be with my friends in J Street. Um, the question of guaranteeing that this is the end of the war was the major issue of concern for Hamas over the last couple of months in the back channel talks and the talks that I was conveying between Witkoff and Hamas. I must say that prior to the Israeli assassination attempt on September 8th in Doha, the Americans were talking about a personal letter from Trump to Hamas guaranteeing that Israel would not renew the war. That was difficult for Hamas to swallow. They had problems believing in the American side to begin with. After the assassination attempt, Hamas was completely convinced that Trump greenlighted it. There was no way that Israel could have done it without the Americans agreeing to it, knowing about it in advance. I think if you asked the average person throughout the Middle East, you won't find anyone who believes that Israel did the attack on Doha without having a green light from Trump. So after the attack, and the attack was on the 9th, on the 10th, I got WhatsApp messages from one of the Hamas leaders, not Ghazi Hamad, the person I'm usually in contact with, but someone else who told me that Hamas was instructed by Qatar to not come out of their places and not to use their phones. And communication was very difficult from that point on. But one of the messages I got a few days later was that we can't trust the Americans. We won't trust the Americans. We don't believe them, which is quite different than the statement that Khalil Chaya made this evening when he, the head of the Hamas movement, who announced that this is the end of the war and Hamas has agreed to it, and ended his talk by thanking President Trump for helping to reach an agreement. But I think what's important is that the deal that was put on the table and presented by Witkoff in the original 21 points, and then more detail was given in the negotiations that took place both prior to Sharm el-Sheikh and in Sharm el-Sheikh, was on the ground realities that are going to change in Gaza very, very quickly. The deployment of a multinational force with Arab participation, with other Muslim state participation, with European participation, is the kind of guarantee that's necessary on the ground to ensure that Israel won't be able to attack Gaza again. It will also guarantee for Israel that Hamas won't be able to attack Israel. Despite the fact that we've only seen what's been published about phase one of the deal, phase two of the deal, which is about Israeli full redeployment out of Gaza, a decommissioning of weapons by Hamas, the establishment of the technocratic government. All these things are in very advanced stages already. It's not like everything is open and has to be negotiated. The proposals are already on the table. They've been talking about them for more than a week. Details have been drawn up. The names of potential people to be in the Gaza government have been discussed. Some of the people have been contacted. There's a Zoom that's probably going to take place in the next day or two between some of these candidates in Gaza and some of the officials in the international community. Samer Sinjalawi, my Palestinian partner, and I have already convened a few Zooms with these Gazan civil society leaders who drafted a letter that I delivered through Witkoff to Trump, saying that we are civil society leaders in Gaza and we are willing to play a role in the new government. On the 11th of this month, Abbas will be meeting with Nasser al-Kidwa, the former Palestinian foreign minister, the former PLO representative in the UN for 17, 18 years. Nasser was just re-brought into the Fatah Central Council, and there's a possibility that Abbas may appoint him to head the Gaza government. That would be a great thing because Samer and I brought Nasser al-Kidwa and Ehud Olmert together to draft a vision paper for the future based on a two-state solution, based on nonviolence, based on a complete anti-Hamas line and a pro-peace line, is something that every member of J Street would easily sign onto as well. And it talked about the forming of this non-Hamas government in Gaza. So I think that we're looking at things that are already on the ground, and it will hopefully guarantee that neither side will be able to break the deal. Of course, what we're going to see happening in the coming days is the release of the 20 living hostages. Hopefully, all of them are living. I believe that Hamas knows where all of them are and who's holding them and can deliver them all at once, which is what they're talking about. The 28 deceased hostages are not all known where they're buried, and this is going to be a problem. I've been talking about this being a problem for more than a year, that we have to be prepared to the possibility that some of the deceased hostages may never be recovered. There are thousands of Gazans who are unknown where their whereabouts are and are believed to be buried under the rubble of buildings that Israel has demolished. 80% of Gaza has been demolished, and there were people in those buildings, and it's very likely that there might have been hostages in some of those buildings as well. So we may have a reality where some of the families are going to suffer the loss and never be able to recover their loved ones. And it's very important to them. I hope that Israel won't perceive this as a breach of the agreement. I think this is one of the reasons why they agreed to establish this international mechanism involving Israel and Egypt, Qatar and Turkey, as well as Hamas on that side, in order to show that there's going to be a real effort to locate all the deceased, and people won't be able to claim that Hamas breached the agreement by not retrieving all the 28 deceased hostages. This is the Middle East and everything is unpredictable. So it could be derailed, but it looks very, very positive. And it looks, the major thing is that Trump made the decision after the Israeli assassination attempt in Doha that the war has to end. And when Trump met Netanyahu in Washington after the UN General Assembly meeting, he simply told Netanyahu, this is it. The war is over. And Trump locked Netanyahu into the deal. The next part was to lock Hamas into the deal. They were having difficulty just with the pressure from Egypt and Qatar. And that's why Witkoff, who's very close friends of Ibrahim Kalin, the Turkish head of intelligence, was brought in. And the Turks did a full court press on Hamas. They really pressured Hamas into saying yes to the deal. And then Trump did something that is unknown of in this kind of diplomacy. It was remarkable because Hamas's answer was yes, but, and Trump simply wrapped it up as yes and announced that the deal is done. And this is the kind of power politics that we haven't seen in the Middle East by an American leader in the past. And I know that Elon was part of the Biden administration, and I think that Biden was a good president for America, but I think he was bad on foreign policy. And I think that here in the Middle East, Biden projected American weakness, and Trump projects American power. And that's the difference. That's what made this deal done. It wouldn't have been done without Trump. I've worked with Witkoff over the past weeks, couple of months, and he's the same kind of operator and deal maker that Trump is, with a bigger vocabulary. But it's the same kind of deal maker politics that you put the deal on the table with a smoking gun ready to be shot, and you walk away until the other side says yes, and you don't leave them an option. And that's basically what Trump did here, and it's remarkable.
So I'm going to jump in because I've got to play like TV host here, and I've got to give Elon a chance to jump in because I saw his head go a little sideways when you said that. And so, Elon,
I
what's
know.
your take on this?
Sure. No, look, so a couple things I want to ask a Gershon question, but also take first. I also think Trump was uniquely positioned to actually be able to pressure Netanyahu in a way that Biden never was. And that had to do with Trump's popularity with Netanyahu's political base, right? And that didn't just happen. That was also specifically cultivated by Netanyahu because Trump and Netanyahu see the world very similarly as right-wing kind of autocrats, anti-democracy. And so, yeah, I acknowledge from the very beginning of this administration that two things. One, I acknowledge that Donald Trump always had more leverage with Bibi Netanyahu, and he really could have ended this war in March if he wanted to. We never should have gone back to the fight. He could have done it then. Could Joe Biden have played the same game with Bibi Netanyahu and gotten the same result last year? Maybe. And I think he should have, and he didn't. I will acknowledge that for sure. I'm not sure it would have led to the same outcome because, Netanyahu spent the entire first year of the war purposefully trying to create distance publicly, creating daylight between him and the United States and using that with his political base to try to tear down Biden. Where with Trump, it's actually the fear of distance and daylight between Trump and Netanyahu publicly has been one of the biggest leverage points that Trump has when he chooses to use it. So I'm not sure I fully buy it. I do buy the fact that Donald Trump was uniquely positioned, but I think there is this nuance, Gershon, that you have to acknowledge. But my question for you is, look, I'm very confident the first part of this deal is going to get done. Not 100%, but it feels like that's going to
And by
happen.
first part, you mean the hostage release, the prisoner exchange, the withdrawal to a certain line, and the trucks coming in. That's the first
Yes,
part.
yes, exactly. And my big question, Gershon, for you is we've had a lot of previous deals in Gaza where they do the first part and then that's it. Everybody says they're going to do other things and they don't happen. I'm hopeful. I think this is a very different war than any of the previous wars. But do you have confidence that parts 2 and 3 happen? And what gives you that confidence that we get to that international force, that we get to that transitional government, that those follow throughs actually happen?
Well, we never know for sure until it happens. But from what I know from my talks with Witkoff and from talks with some of the European leaders and some of the Arab leaders in the region, is that they are all prepared to immediately deploy forces to Gaza. So I think that's done. Witkoff told me a few weeks ago that he already had commitments for more than $2 billion to start the process. And I'm sure that now the deal is done, there'll be a lot more money available for the beginning of the reconstruction, for relocation of Palestinians in Gaza, for creating these new tent cities that need to be put up very, very quickly. So I think that a lot of the groundwork has been laid down by the work that Witkoff has been doing. So I'm pretty confident that the negotiations are going to move quickly forward on the rest of the deal. There's going to be a lot of Israeli kicking and screaming about the American demand for a full redeployment out of Gaza. I know what I talked to Witkoff about, and even Hamas, I talked to them about a no entry zone in the perimeter of Gaza on the Gazan side, but there would be no Israeli troops in Gaza. Hamas agreed to this. It would be a shooting zone that anyone who enters the area would be shot by the Israeli troops from the Israeli side of the border. Hamas didn't have a problem with that. We were talking about a perimeter of 500 meters to a kilometer deep, all across the Israeli-Gaza border. And I understand that the Americans were willing to push Israel to accept that. Hamas agreed to it. With the decommissioning of weapons, the American position was that we can define what that means. It doesn't mean that every Hamas guy who's holding a gun has to turn over their gun. We're talking about weapons that the quote that I was given was that a weapon that can kill more than 5 people at one time has to be decommissioned. It's clear that Hamas will never turn over weapons to Israel, but Hamas has indicated that they would turn over their weapons to a Palestinian security force, maybe a Palestinian security force supported by Egypt. Those are the two big issues here: the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza and Hamas giving up its weapons. Hamas is not going to govern. They know that they're finished in Gaza. Some of the Hamas people told me we need our people to hold our guns to protect ourselves against other Gazans, not against Israel. They're afraid of the Gazans going after them, and they have good reason to be afraid of that. The one other thing I wanted to note about Biden is in September when Hamas gave me in writing their agreement to the 3-week deal, which is basically the same deal as now on the table, but it was in September 2024, and the whole war would be over in 3 weeks. This ended up on the desk of Biden. But Brett McGurk, who was in charge of the negotiations, wouldn't even look at it. I met with 2 people on McGurk's team who were completely frustrated by their inability to even get him or the president to look at this other option rather than the partial deal that Biden had presented in the end of May of 2024, which I immediately thought was a bad deal. And I said so in the media. I thought it was a partial deal that doesn't return everyone, it doesn't end the war, and it had 1 million exit points from the deal. So I didn't know why the American side was investing so much time and energy in a bad deal. I was invited to Qatar and presented it to the Qataris who already had the deal. They knew about it, but they said they couldn't do anything unless the Americans bought into it. And this was the same response of the Egyptian intelligence. They wouldn't move on it. So here Biden had an opportunity to actually adopt a deal that could have ended the war in 3 weeks. By the way, 3 weeks was simply an arbitrary number that I got from Israeli military of the time that they needed to withdraw from Gaza. That's why it ended up being a 3-week deal. It could have been a 2-week deal or a 1-week deal. But I couldn't get anyone in the American administration to look at it because Brett McGurk was simply focused on negotiating the bad deal that he was working on.
And those are some pretty strong words. And I was talking to Elon and a few other people today because you and I were in touch around that time. And I have my texts from that time of trying to get people to pay attention to this. And so I can vouch for you about the approaches that were made and the frustration that you felt. I think we may have done a webinar
Yeah,
around
we
that
did.
time as well on this very topic. And so, I do not know if the leverage that Trump has today over Bibi in terms of his command of the Israeli public and his ability to undermine Bibi's political standing, that leverage was not available to Biden last
No, I
September.
agree. I agree. And it was remarkable. 3 weeks before Trump entered the White House, I was sitting in the Shin Bet headquarters with Ronen Bar, the head of the Shin Bet, and he asked me not to use any of my back channels because in 3 weeks there's going to be a ceasefire. And I looked at my calendar and noticed that 3 weeks was exactly January 20th. And lo and behold, the ceasefire was made on January 19th, simply because Trump told Netanyahu that he wants a ceasefire by the time he enters the White House. And it was done. It was always in the hands of Israel.
Yeah, but Gershon, I think, look, I do think, as Jeremy says, there's both a question of leverage and a question of timing, and those things matter a great deal. And I think if Kamala Harris had won the presidency, we also would have had a deal right at the end of that administration because Netanyahu at that point was able to do a deal. Things fundamentally changed over the summer with a combination of the war in Lebanon and also with the fact that Gideon Sar came into the government so Ben Gvir could leave and Netanyahu's government wouldn't fall apart. So I'm not sure I buy this idea. Look, like I said, I think Donald Trump was an important player in this and did very important, valuable things over the past few weeks, and I will give him credit when credit is due. And that's true. I also am not sure, and I also think I've also written publicly that I thought there were moments where we, as the United States, should have applied more pressure during the Biden administration. Like both of those things are true. I'm just not sure that it's that clear cut as you're describing it. I do think there's a lot more questions, and timing matters, and leverage matters, as we talked about. And I also think it's less about a specific plan than it is about that piece of leverage. I'm not sure that any plan would have worked last September because at that point, Joe Biden was like, Bibi was waiting to see what happened in the election. By September of last year, no American president was going to get Bibi Netanyahu to move, no matter what the plan was, because he was waiting to see what happens in November and he was going to make a play based on that. And so, you
So
know,
let me suggest,
I'd really rather move on to the details.
exactly. Let's
What are
start
we gonna
looking
put here?
forward. I think we'll
100%.
draw a line under this and say
Yes.
we've discussed the backward looking, and I know we've got probably 1,000 people watching between Substack and Zoom here, and I know that people are interested in, well, what's going to happen from here. And we were discussing with Gershon that there are a lot of discussions that have already been well developed regarding the introduction of an international force, regarding the weapons decommissioning. There is a discussion about names of actual Palestinians who could take part in the administration of the territory in the coming months. And I would say that in a way, those types of things are the phase two, right? That's the next step. I'm curious, Gershon, if one thinks of like beyond that to the actual leading towards political resolution of all this, call that phase three. Uh, do you have any insights into whether or not in any of the thinking that Witkoff and others are doing, that they are also thinking about not only the immediate transitional authority and the immediate decommissioning, but politically, how does this lead towards that aspiration that's recognized in the plan of a state? And how does that then tie into the broader interest in normalization? Is that still part of their equation, or is that just way down the line? And for right now, they're just going to focus on phase two.
Yeah, I think it's way down the line. I don't think, just as one of the big disagreements that I've had with Witkoff over the past couple of months was this American idea supported by Netanyahu. In fact, Netanyahu convinced them to support it that Hamas could surrender. Israel could bring Hamas to surrender. And I kept saying to Witkoff and to other Americans that Hamas will never surrender, certainly never surrender to Israel. I think that the American administration, the Trump administration, has not yet grasped the understanding that without the creation of a Palestinian state next to Israel, this conflict will not end. Trump was asked about it today. He said he doesn't really have an opinion on it yet. The parties need to decide on it. I think one thing that is very clear to me is that as long as our current leadership is in power, there's no chance of looking toward that future stage of resolution of the conflict. When I say our leaders, I mean Netanyahu and Mahmoud Abbas, because I don't think that either of those two leaders are capable of moving us forward into any kind of real, genuine peace process. There is only one solution to the conflict, and we've known that for a very long time. It's the two-state solution, and it's back on the table in a way like it's never been there before. I think that there will be a rapid realization on both sides of this conflict that we can't keep doing this. We can't keep killing each other. We can't keep fighting. Even at the end of the war, there's 7 million Israeli Jews and 7 million Palestinian Arabs, more or less, between the river and the sea, and there is no other solution. So I think that there will be an awakening in both societies, a realization, even as we're getting from trauma to post-trauma, that we need something new and different. Well, I don't know who the Israeli political leaders are going to move us in that direction. There's no question that anyone of the potential candidates is better than Netanyahu, but some of these guys are crazy also. Bennett is Ehud Olmert describes Bennett as Ben Gvir in a suit. He's a right-wing annexationist. My understanding is that one thing that the Trump administration has understood and has told the Arab partners, not only Hamas, but the Qataris, the Emiratis, the Jordanians, the Egyptians, is that the US will not allow Israel to annex parts of the West Bank. And if
That's
that's
so
true,
significant, Gershon. I
it
think that
is.
in our camp in the US, which of course, we have a long, long bill of particulars with the Trump administration about what it's doing, not only in this country, but around the world. And none of us have any love for the Trump administration. But I think in our camp, there's been an assumption that the Trump administration would come in and basically just greenlight anything that Netanyahu and the right wing want to do. But I think what you're implying and what I've seen is that the Trump administration actually is looking to hold the line against the worst of what could potentially happen. Why is that? What is in it? Why is Trump and the Kushner Witkoff world? Why are they doing this?
I think that one of the things is because we're dealing with the world of business. One of the interesting things about Witkoff, he's the first American Jewish emissary working for an American president who's not Israel focused. Witkoff's investments were in Qatar and the Emirates. They weren't in Israel. He's grown to love the Israeli people and he's had a great attachment to the families of hostages, but his focus in the Middle East was in the Arab Gulf. It was not in Israel. And Trump profited greatly from his relationship with Qatar and from his relationship with the Saudis. And Trump, as opposed to Biden, does not describe himself as a Zionist. He loves Israel. He has a great affection for the people of Israel, maybe even for Netanyahu. I don't know. Um, I don't think Trump works by emotion. I think he works by the bottom line. And the bottom line for the United States is investment in the Arab world, not in Israel. And I think changes the perspective on what's necessary. And the Arab leaders have told him very directly that if Israel annexes parts of the West Bank or all the West Bank, it's the end of the Abraham Accords. There's no chance of any kind of normalization with Saudi Arabia. It puts the United States in a very difficult position with its relationship with Israel and trying to increase its interest and financial investments of the Arab world in the United States. So we have a whole different twist on this issue. I think it's very clear Trump has dissociated himself from the Gaza Riviera plan. The American position and what they told the Qataris, the Egyptians, the Turks, and Hamas is that Gaza will be redeveloped for the Gazans, not for Israeli settlers, not the vision that he put down on paper of rebuilding of the Jared Kushner vision of seeing Gaza as a beachfront real estate. It's changed and it's changed rapidly and dramatically, and let's hope it stays there.
Yeah, I still think, look, I do think there's all the potential here, and I actually think it's quite positive. And I also have my concerns about folks like Avigdor Lieberman and Naftali Bennett. But we're going to need a different government in Israel if we want to make real progress on any of this.
For
And I think
sure.
that's really the pivot moment that's coming next year. I don't know how long it's going to take. And Gershon, I'm interested in your perspective on whether this deal, it doesn't feel like this deal,
Right.
for all the talk, doesn't feel like this deal is knocking down the government. I think a lot of this was, especially from Smotrich bluster. I can see like there's just no incentive, I think, for Smotrich to leave the government, because if he does and he starts new elections and his polling looks terrible, that's not what's going to happen here. Ben
But
Gvir might be
Ben Gvir is polling very
yeah,
well. He's doing
yeah.
well, and Ben Gvir
Yeah,
could
Ben Gvir is
help the
polling
government.
well, and also Ben Gvir can leave without toppling the government. But you're going to have this election next year, and I really feel this election, it's a fundamental choice about the future of the conflict. Because if you're actually able to elect a different government, and they don't have to be perfect, and I actually don't think Bennett will get as many seats as he's polling at. He tends to always go down as we
Right.
get closer to elections. But even if you have the Golans and Eisenkotts and Lapids as part of this government, it will be such a healthier government where you can start to make meaningful progress on all the things you're talking about, Gershon, and get into a healthy cycle and see where that goes, as opposed to where we've been, for so long. But if you have Netanyahu, or if you just have stalemate and Netanyahu stays in as caretaker, this thing could still go very, very, very negative. We could
No
still
doubt.
be looking at going towards the world of Ben Gvir and Smotrich. It feels to me like managing the conflict is dead as a concept. And the question is, are we going to start moving back towards peace and towards something real, the 23-state solution, as we like to call it here? Or are we going towards this very dark vision, which really takes you kind of towards permanent apartheid?
Yeah.
Uh,
There's
and
there's
no,
another wild card in the deck though that's important to take into account, and and that's the commitment that Mahmoud Abbas made to MBS and to Macron, that within a year there would be Palestinian elections. And he also said that the election law would be corrected so that only political parties that support the line of the PLO of supporting a two-state solution would be allowed to run, which means that any party that supports the armed struggle or parties like Hamas would not be able to participate. And the question is if we're going to see some new leadership coming out of Palestine, and if the elections in Palestine were to take place before the elections in Israel, and there is a positive dynamic in the Palestinian elections, it could potentially have a deep impact on the Israeli electorate. Those are a lot of ifs.
Yeah, there's
I
also
know that there are a lot of people on the Palestinian side who are talking about organizing and creating new political parties and new visions that are based on peace. There's a growing realization amongst Palestinian intellectuals and others that there is no viable armed struggle anymore. The war in Gaza proves that they will not liberate Palestine. They will not get a Palestinian state by killing Israelis. And the more that kind of talk enters into Palestinian political life, the bigger the chances that what happens on the Palestinian side will have a positive impact on Israel.
we also
So
need
let me just ask you a quick question about Palestinian leadership. It naturally leads to the question of Marwan Barghouti, and that's several questions in the chat have said, is he going to be part of this deal or not? And
we don't know. About 10 days ago, I started writing to Witkoff about Marwan, give him his record, given my own personal stories of knowing Marwan, and I knew him since 1996. I gave him background on what Marwan was accused of and convicted of, how he didn't recognize the legitimacy of the court and presented no defense, and the importance of releasing Marwan. I was asked by the American side to bring in some opinions of mainstream Israelis. I got about 20 different Israelis from security background and political background, former high-level ministers in Israeli governments to give opinions. The majority were in favor of releasing Marwan, but there were some strong opinions against, and I sent it all to the Americans. There were people in the middle who said if Marwan could be helpful and useful, then he should be released, but it wasn't very clear. I was also contacted by Marwan's family and asked to lobby on behalf of Marwan but I don't know what's decided. And we should know that in a couple of hours because the government decision has to include the list of Palestinian prisoners. Now, I know that there are 250 Palestinian prisoners serving life sentences who will be freed in this deal. That leaves another 40 in prison. The last 40 of the Palestinian prisoners who are serving life sentences. And there's been strong objection in the Israeli government to releasing Marwan Barghouti, which is quite stupid. But that's the nature of our government in Israel. They don't see releasing Marwan as an opportunity. But Hamas put Marwan at the top of their list, and they were quite insisting that he be included in the deal. So we should know soon.
Elon, I'm sorry I interrupted you earlier. Did you want to ask a follow-up?
I've lost track on what it is I was going to ask.
My apologies.
But I do think the Marwan, I mean, I will say, I think it'd be great to have the Marwan. Actually, here's what I was going to say. One of the big issues also with having Palestinian elections is it possible we can get to a world with a different Israeli government? This is increasingly what I'm talking to people about because they say to me, there is no partner, there is no partner. What are we to do? Which is, look, Palestinian Authority has lots of challenges and it has corruption and, poor governance, and we need a new set of leaders. It's also true that you've had a model since 2009 of we're going to provide financial support to Hamas, let money come in from Doha to the Ben Gurion airport and go in pure cash, like no supervision at all. And at the same time, we're going to starve the Palestinian Authority and take away their money. It's crazy. I wonder if part of this is also if we can get to an Israeli government and mentality where it's not just the Palestinians need to be better, but oh wow, maybe we can actually play a constructive world and we're role in getting the right Palestinians and getting more moderate Palestinians and empowering them instead of weakening them, I think is another big piece of this. And maybe, just maybe, what's happened over the last couple of years will mean that we go in that direction. Because I'll tell you one thing that's been utterly discredited is precisely this question of this strategy of just empowering Hamas in order to weaken the PA and keep Gaza and the West Bank split.
I think that's definitely 100% true. It never made sense to me since the beginning of the work that I've been doing now, almost 50 years, of why any Israeli would want our Palestinian neighbors to be poor and suffering. It makes no sense as an Israeli to want to have poor neighbors who are suffering. So I think that the policy of the current Israeli government, which is the policy of Smotrich right now, the Israeli government owes the Palestinian Authority about $2 billion in tax money that Israel collects on behalf of the Palestinian Authority and refuses to give it to them. And the Palestinian Authority is bankrupt. They've gotten some more money from the Saudis recently and from some others, but they are debted out to all the Palestinian banks. They can't borrow money from anyone anymore. 160,000 to 200,000 Palestinians who worked in Israel before October 7th haven't worked a day inside of Israel since then, and that provided easily 30-40% of the Palestinian economy. So the West Bank is really suffering, in addition to the massive construction of settlements, the stealing of land, the chopping down of trees, the killing of Palestinians in the West Bank by settlers, while the army and the police stand by and watch it. I mean, these are all things that could easily lead to an explosion in the West Bank. The only reason why an explosion isn't happening is because people are exhausted. They simply don't have the energy. One of the points that the Israelis make, which is a conceptual lie, unfortunately supported by surveys done by people like Khalil Shakaki, when Khalil Shakaki asks Palestinians, do you support the armed struggle? And gets a massive number, 60, 70% of people. I've argued with Khalil and said to him, why don't you ask the second question? He said, what's the second question? Said, are you willing to pick up a gun and shoot the Israelis? And if he were to ask that question, the number would go down to 5% of the Palestinians in the West Bank. And if you ask them, are you willing to send your son to shoot the Israelis, the number would go down to 2%. So we have a very wrong impression of where Palestinians are. They don't have the energy to fight Israel. They don't want the West Bank to turn into Gaza. They are angry and hurting and pained and distressed, but they don't want to turn the West Bank into Gaza. And that's what's preventing the explosion right now. But if this continues, it will explode because there's a limit to how much people can suffer.
So I know there's a few questions in the chat. I just want to make sure we're probably in the last few minutes of the conversation. It's almost midnight in Jerusalem, and so I just want to make sure we're kind to Gershon here. One of the questions that came through on our Substack feed is how specifically was Netanyahu pressured to go along with the deal? What was the stick? You know, so many times in the US, the conversation is about withholding arms and, you know, some form of UN veto. And, you know, these are the things that come to people's mind in terms of pressure. But we've talked a lot about how Trump brought pressure to bear. What do you see as the pressure that actually worked?
I think it was very simple. I mean, we saw film of the White House, of the Oval Office meeting where Trump forced Netanyahu to call the Prime Minister of Qatar and apologize. And Trump completely scripted that, or Trump's people did. They gave Netanyahu the exact words of what he had to say to the Qatari Prime Minister. I think in the follow-up of that meeting after that phone call, Trump simply told Netanyahu, that's it, the war is over. You're finishing it. And you're going to announce that you support ending the war in exchange for releasing the hostages. You can declare victory. You can say that you've achieved all your goals. But I think Trump simply put it down to Netanyahu that he doesn't have a choice. He's not leaving the Oval Office without saying that this deal is going through and I agree to it. And that's what happened. I don't think Trump had to threaten Netanyahu with anything. I think the nature of the relationship was always, since Trump came back to the White House, that he could have done this months ago. But he bought into Netanyahu's idea that Hamas can surrender. I had one of these amazing phone calls with Witkoff over this issue of surrendering. And they really believed that Hamas could surrender. But I think they came to the understanding that that's not going to happen and the war could go on for a lot longer. And Trump didn't want it anymore. He decided it had to end. And he told Netanyahu, and that was it.
So there's a lot of conversation in the chat about the Israeli side of this. You know, at the end of the day, is there going to be, if there has to be, in order for any of this to move forward, a commitment to a Palestinian state? And we know that Israeli public opinion is turned against the, you know, common phrase of a two-state solution or the idea of a Palestinian state as a reward for Hamas's attack. But if that's key at the end of the day to the end game here, do you see a route to changing the nature of Israeli public opinion about the idea of a state of Palestine?
Yeah, I don't look at those surveys amongst Israeli public opinion about final status issues and a two-state solution. The state of Palestine, I think Israel is still a society in trauma and is really not capable of thinking coherently and logically about our future. The pain of October 7th has been with us for 2 years. It's repeated every day in the media. It's what we see all the time, what we hear all the time. Today was the first day that we saw Israelis smiling in 2 years. First day that we saw Israelis smiling. So I don't think it's really an important question to ask right now. I think it will happen because there is no other alternative. And the more pragmatic talk that we hear from leaders in the region and from Palestinians themselves will change Israeli public opinion very rapidly. Look, as my good friend and colleague and partner Samer Sinjalawi says all the time, it's important for the Israelis to understand that they could be part of a very important part of the world today. Israel associated itself for decades with Europe, when the Middle East is the place where development is happening, where things are changing. The Arab world is a different Arab world than it was a decade ago. And Netanyahu used to describe Israel as a villa in the jungle. Israel could be a villa in a very nice neighborhood. I mean, anyone who's traveled to the Emirates or to even Qatar has seen the potential of what this region has for us, what's happening in Saudi Arabia under the leadership of Mohammed bin Salman, with all the negative things we might think about him. He is making significant changes in Saudi Arabia. Even the changes that we look in education, and the changes that were made in the Emirates, anyone who visits the Emirates and talks to Emiratis about the relationship to Judaism and to Jews and to Christians, it's a different Middle East. And the Israelis will come to understand that we can be part of that. Israel's future is based here in the region. It's not based in Scandinavia. It's here.
And far more Israelis are going every year to go shopping in Dubai than live on the West Bank. And, that's something to just keep in mind. The hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Israelis who are looking to do deals and travel and buy and shop.
It's remarkable when the whole world shut down its flights to Israel. The Emirati Airlines increased the number of their daily flights. There were 16 flights a day going to Abu Dhabi and Dubai through every day of the world when every other airline except the Israeli airlines were not flying here anymore. The Emirati Airlines kept flying, and it was amazing. And a lot of Israelis who even wanted to go to Europe had to go to Dubai before they went to Europe because there
How
was
I
no
got
other
to
way of
Israel.
getting there.
I mean, that's how I got to Israel. I think it's a couple of reasons. I think it's that I also think the Emiratis are used to flying through Houthi missiles, unfortunately, and so that's part of it too. Those airlines have a better sense of how to deal with that. But yeah, no, it's true.
So Gershon, we're about to wrap up, and before you got on, I mentioned that I'm sitting at the Carter Presidential Center. I happen to be sitting in front of a photo, which may be a bit blurry on the camera here, but it's a photo of Carter on the deck of Camp David with Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat. And I'm reminded by the conversations we've just been having of Jimmy Carter's book, which I discovered in a chat with the staff here was 20 years ago, Peace or
Or
Apartheid.
apartheid, yeah.
And we are at that fork in the road. The moment of truth is here. The pathway to peace, which is a regional comprehensive peace. It's an integration of Israel into its neighborhood. It is these flights to Dubai, and it's the acceptance of Israel as a country and the non-pariah state version of the future for them versus the vision of Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, and Netanyahu and greater Israel and isolation internationally and apartheid. And that is we're at that moment. We're
We
at the
certainly
fork in
are.
the road.
The chapter that we have in front of us, which is going to be very difficult to deal with, is when Gaza is opened up and the international media enters Gaza and
Yeah.
sees the dimensions of the destruction that have taken place. Israel will go through a very difficult period of this pariah state status until there's significant political change in Israel, because what we have done in Gaza is unimaginable, and people will see it very, very vividly very soon.
Yeah.
That is such important words for us to end on here. This next phase is so vitally important. I want to make sure we're all focused in the coming 72, 96 hours on the end of the fighting, approval of the agreement, release of the hostages, the terms of the deal being enforced from prisoner release to IDF pullback. These next 72, 96 hours are really important. The President of the United States will be speaking in front of your parliament on Sunday, I believe. The hostages should be coming back on Monday. This is a very historic weekend.
They may be coming back sooner. This is also a possibility.
Wow.
Of course, one of the Haredi parties already threatened Netanyahu that they shouldn't be brought back on Shabbat. This is just crazy. But we could see hostages coming back even by Shabbat. And it's nice to see Israelis smiling. This has been a very sad country over the past 2 years. And internally here at home, it'll be nice to feel something else. It'll be very nice not to have to go to a demonstration every Saturday night. We might actually have other options in life other than going to
You
demonstrations.
still have to save your democracy. There's still
Yeah.
a little matter
That's
of
right.
things.
You can't, Gershon, you can't stop.
Can't stop now.
Gotta continue. Sorry.
I
Maybe a couple of weeks.
can't quit the protests. Well, thank you very, very much on behalf of J Street and Word on the Street Live special briefing on the ceasefire agreement to be with Gershon Baskin, one of the leaders of efforts over 5 decades, it sounds like now. I didn't realize 50 years, Gershon. We are getting a little older.
Sure.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you for staying up late. Thank you for all you do and your insights. We really appreciate it. Elon, I'll be back in Washington soon enough that I will see you live and in person.
Safe travels.
All right.
Night, Gershon.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.